We didn't know what the next step would be. We knew we hadn't got an SOS off. We knew that we were 200 miles west of the Galapagos Islands. We had no water and no food, as we thought then. I was born in the middle of England, Staffordshire, and we were farmers. So we ran a hill farm for the first 16 years of my life. And my dad was a former sea captain, and my mum was a nurse from, she'd worked in Hong Kong and the Middle East. We lived in a market town, and our whole lives revolved around farming. But we used to listen to my dad's stories of when he was at sea, and, you know, sailors can always spin a good yarn, so we used to sit enthralled with his stories. It was in 1968 that there was a round-the-world yacht race. Sailing around the world in those days was an adventure all in itself, because there was no electronic navigation, there were no electronic safety aids. It was, you were on your own, basically. My brother Neil said, "Daddy's a sailor, why don't we sail around the world?" Like a throwaway comment. But that really sparked an idea in Dougal's head, my dad's head. He was just, you know, living hand to mouth, and he considered his children to be very unworldly, because we were in this sort of rural setting, and he thought, why not? Somehow, from that little seed, a plan grew that we would sail around the world. And it seems a little bit crazy now, looking back, but it seemed very normal to us as we were growing up. First of all, we had to find a boat, so we spent a lot of time looking for about 2 years to find the right sort of boat. And I think it was my mum who found what was advertised as a world gurgler. I think it was probably July or August of 1970. We met up in Falmouth, and that was going to be our new life.
Can you just explain who was on the boat?
So there was my mum and dad, then there was my sister and myself. We were sort of 5 years older than the twins, and then the twins. So we had a berth each. It was a 6-berth yacht with a saloon and a galley and a forecastle, so 45 foot long, that sort of length. It was January, by the time the wind shifted to the right quarter, that enabled us to set sail around the world, wherever that was. You know, we were so naive when I think back to it. We had no idea where we were going. And we took Lisbon, wherever that is, you know, and Lisbon was going to be our first foreign port. If you've got no experience of yachts, sailing on a yacht sounds very, very exotic when it's in the harbour, tied up alongside. Looks very nice. People come down and say, what a nice yacht. They've got no idea what it's like on a yacht at sea. There are things to bang your head on. There are things to fall over. There are cleats to stub your toes on. There are words, a new vocabulary that you've never heard of before. You know, we sailed across the Atlantic. It took us 33 days to get across the Atlantic. It's the same time it took Christopher Columbus, almost 300 years before us. And, you know, this was more like it. This was what we'd dreamed of, calm seas, tropical weather, discovery, a voyage of discovery. In one of those many adventures that I referred to, we'd rescued a fisherman who was adrift in his fishing boat. And in a sort of really strange setup, we towed him under sail. We towed his fishing boat with us under sail to Nassau in the Bahamas. As a reward, one of the sort of Rotarians of the local society offered us a gift from his dive shop of any present that we would like to have. And my sister fell in love with his son, and suddenly announced that she would no longer be coming with us on the trip. She was going to call it a day there, and she was going to live with Jeff, and that was a shock to us all. And we sailed off to the San Blas Islands, which are just to the east of Panama. In Panama, we picked up a student, could pick up people who were looking to partake in the same adventure and help pay for the voyage. So Robin Williams joined us. After some sort of extended cruising there, we sailed through the canal and we were then in the Pacific Ocean. So the next leg of our trip had started, really. Once we got through the canal, there was no going back. We were on our way to Australia and New Zealand. We had a very rough sort of departure from Galapagos because the wind was quite strong, 4-6, and the waves were quite large, and we were in a reach, which is on the beam. The wind was on the beam, and it made the boat roll quite heavily. But we were used to it, by then. I mean, when I think back to how we left Falmouth, we were 100% seasoned sailors. We could sail the boat in pitch black. We knew the rules of the road. We knew how to sail. Well, we were 200 miles west of Cape Espinosa in the Galapagos Islands. It was quarter past 10, I think, but I think Dougal recorded it as 10 o'clock. And he was working a sight out, and an observation of the sun to get a fix of the boat's position. And he'd put a coffee on, the coffee percolator on the stove, and a little did he know that he was never going to drink that coffee, because the events of the next few seconds were going to change all our lives forever. I was up in the cockpit with my brother Sandy, who was at the wheel, and Robin had gone to bed because he'd done the night watch, and suddenly there was an ear-splintering crash, and the boat jolted 3 times, and there were 3 crashes, one after the other. Bang, 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 like that. And the boat jolted heavily. It was lifted out of the water, and she settled back into the water, and it felt like we'd gone aground at high speed. And I poked my head down the hatch to say to my dad, what is that? What was that? And I noticed he was up to his ankles in water. And I asked him what he was doing. Like, didn't he know that was dangerous? I thought he'd opened a seacock or something like that. And he said, where's this water coming from? And then there was a big noise behind me over on the left-hand side, and 3 killer whales appeared following us. Like, if you can get it in your mind, a big daddy one, a little baby one in between, and a mummy one on the far side. And the big one, the big daddy one, had his head split open and blood was pouring out into the sea. We'd come through the doldrums about 2 months before, and we'd had a big whale, baleen whale, try to make love to the boat. It rubbed itself up alongside, and we thought, if that whale could mistake us for another whale for the purpose of mating, maybe the killer whales had attacked us for thinking we were also thinking that we were a whale for food purposes. I poked my head back down the hatch to Dougal, and he was up to his waist in water. And I thought, if he doesn't shut that seacock soon, you have ridiculous thoughts, we're going to sink. I said, Dad, what? And he said, abandon ship. And I said, abandon, I was a petulant 18-year-old, abandon ship. What are you talking about, I said, to where, Dougal? I said, we're not in Miami Marina now. He said, over there. And I sort of first got the first inkling that things had gone horribly wrong, and this wasn't supposed to be happening. I started to take the sails down, and Dougal appeared briefly on the deck and said, what are you doing? Get the life raft over the side. And I thought, my God, I'm not going to wake up from this. This is really happening. I've got to get moving now. I got the dinghy over the side. I tied it to the rail. I put the oars in the dinghy, and I got the life raft over the side, which was quite heavy. And I pulled the cord in, and I remember the raft, a loud bang as the raft started to inflate. And I thought, my God, thank the Lord that's happened. At least we can get into the raft. And then I was washed off the deck. So in that time scale, probably a couple of minutes. I managed to swim. I was very frightened that the whales were going to get us at that moment because they were still around, and I kept feeling for my legs to see if I still had them. I swam round to the raft entrance and climbed in, and everybody was sitting there, yellow, very yellow looking from the canopy overhead, and we were all in shock about what had just happened, and they thought I'd been lost, and they were my mum and dad especially were very sort of pleased to see me, and they helped pull me on board, and we then had to sort of sit and take stock of what had happened, and the twins were crying, and my mum said to them, "Don't be frightened," and the twins said, "We're not crying because we're frightened, Mum, we're crying because Lucette's gone." So Lucette had been our home for 2 years. She'd been the source of many adventures, and now she was gone. And we had a very uncertain future in front of us. We didn't know what the next step would be. We knew we hadn't got an SOS off. We knew that we were 200 miles west of the Galapagos Islands. We had no water and no food, as we thought then. And the enormity of what had just happened was starting to hit us. And my mum said that we should say the Lord's Prayer. And I'll never forget my dad's, he was a hard man, my dad, Navy trained, we used to say. And he said, "Well, I don't believe in God, so I am not going to say the Lord's Prayer." And I said to him, "Dougal, can't you just say the Lord's Prayer anyway?" You know, I said, "We might need God very soon. We might be meeting him much sooner than we think." And he said, "Well, you know, if there is a God, don't you think he'd know that, Douglas? And so there's no point pretending." But we did say the Lord's Prayer, and we thought that we might need some divine assistance if we were to survive the next few days. The raft was quickly blown clear of the wreck site, and then we were on our own, truly on our own. I always remember looking out at the sea, and this frigate bird flew down, and a flying fish jumped out of the sea, and the frigate bird just snapped it up and flew off with it, you know, as if mocking us, you know. And I said to my dad, I said, "They've got millions of years on us." And Dougal said something that was which was to help us in the future and perhaps signify how we might survive. He said, "Yes, Douglas, but we've got brains, and with brains we can make tools, and with tools we can survive."
And so there were 6 of you on the raft. And how big was the raft?
Well, the raft was a 10-man raft, but it's for 10 sitting people, so it's not designed to be lived on. And so we filled that space. And we then had the dinghy, which was a 3-man dinghy, in that it had 3 thwarts. And we noticed there was a survival pack in the raft. It had, I think it was, say 20 tins of water. I think it was 18 actually. And it had some glucose tablets and some biscuits. There was some flotsam going by, and I managed to grab this Genoa sail and my mum's sewing basket, which turned out to be an absolute treasure trove. Bits of copper wire, bits of string, bits of ribbon, bits of cloth and a needle and thread, and tools, basically tools. And we didn't quite know how to use them yet, but we knew that they were valuable. We knew where we were roughly, and Dougal had come up with this plan that I should row the dinghy, we should empty the dinghy, and I should row it to the Galapagos Islands and raise the alarm. I mean, we were sailors by then. We knew the current was 2.5 knots away from, that's 50 miles a day, taking us away from the Galapagos. The wind was another 50 miles a day, blowing away, the trade winds blowing us away from Galapagos. That's 100 miles a day. That's 4 knots. I'd have to row that boat at 4 knots just to stand still. There was no way I could row faster than that. 24 hours, how many days would I have to stay awake? And I remember at 18 and a half, with a very strong-willed father, I remember saying to him, Dad, I'm not going to do that. That is a fool's errand, and I will die, and as a result, you will die. And that was the sort of first time I'd ever sort of said something sensible to my dad, you know, that he'd listened to. And I remember him saying, I'm sorry, Douglas, for asking you. I should never have asked. But it was the desperation that was making me ask. And we need another plan. We need to make another plan. But there was one option. And when I go back to that big baleen whale again, that was in the doldrums. And in the doldrums, it rains heavily. And we knew we could survive without food perhaps for quite some time, but we couldn't survive without water. So we made a plan to sail to the center of the Pacific Ocean, try and stay in the doldrums, where we could get a supply of water, and then sail east towards the Americas, and that somehow we might get picked up along that route. So we made a sail, and we used the oars from the raft as a boom for the makeshift sail. And Dougal's idea, we would sail the dinghy backwards, towing the raft, so that the wind would catch the trade winds would catch the sail and tow the raft, and that would maybe save us a couple of days on the way to the doldrums. So every day would count. We knew that.
How are you feeling, Dick? Did you have hope that you would survive, or did you think...
No, desperate. I mean, we thought we were going to die anytime now. The moment of truth is going to arrive at our doorstep, and it'll be a wave, it'll be a whale. Don't forget, we'd just been hit by those whales, and we thought maybe they would come back to us, or other whales would find us. But on the 6th day, we spied the first ship from the shipping lanes that we thought we might see. The name of that ship was the Straught Cook. And she sailed right past us. And that was a very, very tough moment to take, because we realised suddenly that it wasn't a question of surviving till we got rescued, that somehow we had to survive until we got ourselves out of this mess. And we fired 5 flares, 3 hand flares and 2 parachute flares at that ship. And I said, Dad, we had one flare left. I said, Dad, fire it straight at the bridge of the ship. And he said, I can't do that, Douglas. You may have explosives on deck, something like that. But Dougal did have a revelation at that point. And he said, we're not going to get rescued, and we can't rely on that. He said, we have got to sail from here to America. That's 75 days. And we just thought, how can we survive 75 days in this?
How were you keeping your spirits up, and how was the dynamic between all of you?
Well, everybody has a purpose, you know, in a survival story. And whilst my dad was our leader, and my mum was our carer, and I was the muscles behind Dougal's sort of leadership and bright ideas that he came up with, Robin, who was our passenger, Robin Williams, he was a well-educated young man who hadn't got hardly any experience at sea, only what he'd had with us. But he could talk, and boy could he talk. And boy was it good to listen to his voice. I remember saying to him, Robin, tell me about the time when you were stuck in the bus station in Florida, that time. And he said, what? Again? You know, I say, yes, again. You know, we just wanted to hear each other's voices, you know. And we invented a cafe that we would open when we got home, because that gave us an excuse to talk about food. And we talked about food an awful lot, because we hadn't got any. And the most exotic foods that you could think of. And you had to describe how you would make them, how you'd prepare them, how you would cook them, how you would serve them. Every detail was of great importance. And that's how we kept our spirits up. And my dad kept a map of where he thought we might be. We had no navigation equipment, but we knew that the sun rose in the east and set in the west. We knew that the waves, the underlying swell, was still coming from the southeast. So we knew that as long as that was on the behind us, that we were still headed north. And so we had an idea of where we were, and we would tick off the mileage every day, another 10 miles today, another 20 miles today, which was chipping away at that overall distance that we had to sail. And Dougal came up with a password, which was survival. We're going to say that every day. We're not going to say rescue. We are going to say survival. And survival is what we're going to do. I always remember saying to my dad, he was quite astonished at how brutal I'd become. I said, I've read somewhere that you can drink turtle blood. You should catch one of these and drink its blood. And, how were we going to get the blood out of the turtle? Well, we had no solutions, But I thought I'd catch it. And I hit it on the head with a paddle. And I remember his eyes filling up with blood as he swam off and made good his escape. And I thought to myself, well, that's a bit silly. You're going to die anyway, why are you trying to escape? And I remember sort of discussing with my father how actually we had to catch these animals, hunt them. This was not like ashore now. The next turtle came along and I thought, well, I'm not going to let it swim away. I'm going to capture it and lift it out of the water. Everybody's jumped up on the side, side of the raft, and like, what are you doing, Douglas? That it was like taking a box of matches into a gunpowder store. Dougal grabbed the turtle and threw it out through the forward entrance, and it was gone. And so plan number 2 didn't work. A third turtle came along, and I wrapped it up in the lifeline. There was a lifeline attached to the raft. 100 feet or maybe 100 meters or something. And I wrapped him up in that so he couldn't get away. And then we towed him round to the dinghy, hauled him on board, Dougal did that, and cut his throat and drank his blood. We cut his shell open and she was full of red meat, like steak, and eggs, full of eggs, like grapes, like bunches of grapes. And we realised there's a food source there that we could probably live off. And all we needed was more turtles. But for now, we drank the blood of this turtle. And we knew that then, that we perhaps for the first time stood a chance of surviving. So on the 10th day, roughly, as we'd planned it, the skies changed, the clouds changed. And we noticed there was a high cloud in the upper atmosphere. And mariners know that a change in the wind means a change in the weather. A change in the sky is a change in the weather. And we had very little water left, 1 or 2 cans. And I remember saying to my dad, I said, will it rain tonight, do you think? And he said, I don't know, son, I don't know. And I said, well, do you think it'll rain? I was trying to get some kind of positive statement out of it. And he said, Douglas, I'm not a prophet. I don't know whether it's going to rain or not. He says, but if it does rain, we must be ready to catch it. And I thought about that. And the next day, the sun came out. Where was the rain? Beautiful weather. And as our water supplies began to dwindle dangerously low, we perhaps realised we'd made a huge mistake and that we weren't actually waiting for the rain, but we were waiting to die of thirst. And this assumption that it always rained in the doldrums was exactly that, just an assumption. 3 days went by and then it rained. And, that was a turning point in our lives. Suddenly, we had this water and we filled it all up. Filled our water cans up, we filled our other things that we could catch water in. And we knew perhaps our plan was going to work, that with enough water we could survive. And we sang with joy because we'd managed to collect water and We'd caught a few turtles as well by then, and the next stage of our survival was about to start. Surviving was hard work, drying food, cutting it, catching turtles. And when we were sitting in the raft, we were sitting up to our chests in water, into that cold water. And that itself was debilitating us to, nearly to our deaths anyway. We were so cold, and we had immersion foot, and we had seawater boils. We were covered in seawater boils, and we were life was very painful. You couldn't sleep. If you did sleep, your head would drop into the sea and into the water, and then you'd wake up again. And there was one dry place on the raft, and we would take it in turns to sleep in that spot. You get an hour. And I always remember my mum, God bless her, giving up her turn so that we could sleep in the dry. Something we thought nothing of then. But as I advance in years, I think of that great sacrifice that she made for us. On the 17th day, the raft had it, and the floor dropped out of it, and we knew that we couldn't stay in the raft any longer, and that we would have to all get in the dinghy. That would be 6 of us in a 3-man dinghy. Along came a turtle while we were doing that, while we were disembarking from the raft to the dinghy, and we caught this. It was a pretty big turtle as well, 35-pound turtle, and we put him in the dinghy as well, and the 6 of us, and we were still afloat. This all happened over about an hour, and we watched the raft float away, and we thought, well, it got us this far. Without that raft, we would never have got off the Lucette in the first place. And now this truly is on our own. We're in a boat that we could sink. We have to keep it afloat. There were 6 of us sitting in a 3-man space, and we had at least another 700 miles to go if we were still on plan, which we didn't know for sure whether that was the case. Then one night, probably the 20th day or thereabouts, I saw the North Star in the sky. And I woke my dad up and said, Dougal, look. I said, that's the North Star. Now, mariners know you can only see the North Star from 5 or 6 degrees north of the equator. And we had sunk 2 degrees south of the equator. That meant that we had sailed 7 degrees to the north, or 420 miles. Proof positive that we were in the northern hemisphere and that we were on track. Suddenly the bits were coming together to realise that we might just survive this thing. On the 38th day, we'd been adrift 6.5 weeks now, and it had rained heavily that night, and we were frightened for our lives then, and we often bailed, bailing water out of the dinghy all night, and one particular night, all 3 of us bailing all night, trying to keep the dinghy afloat, and we felt pretty good in spirit, the seas were calming, and we were talking about how many miles we might make under oars and how far off we were from land. We were talking about Dougal's Kitchen. That was the cafe that we'd invented to talk about food. And it was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And Dougal saw a ship. We had forgotten almost that ships could pick us up as well. Rescue was not ruled out completely. I know we'd sort of convinced ourselves that we were on we were going to survive and sail to America, but now suddenly this opportunity might present itself where we could be rescued. We quickly cleared the decks, took the sail down, and Dougal held up first one hand flare, And they didn't see that. And the ship was getting closer and closer. This time she would come within maybe a mile, which is very close at sea. And we had one last hand flare left, and Dougal, we all steadied the dinghy as he held up the flare. And the flare, there was no wind, although there was a swell, there was no wind, and the flux of the flare was dropping onto his hand, burning his hand, but he still sort of held it up, and then he threw it away. And that was the bit the Japanese helmsman saw on the fishing boat, which was now, as I say, about a mile away. And he altered course. And we watched the alteration of course, not daring to believe that he was altering course for us. We had no clothes on. Our clothes had long gone. But my mother had saved us some little rags that we were to put on for being rescued. Only my mum could think of that at a time like this, you know. She says, I don't want you showing your bare body, so we put these on, you know. And the Toka Maru, as she was called, approached and came alongside. She was about 100 metres away, maybe a bit closer than that, actually 100 feet, say. They threw a rope out to us, a dirty, oily, smelly rope. And I grabbed hold of that rope and I held it in my hand and looked at it and realised that this rope was our lifeline to another life, a life that we'd left behind so long ago, it seemed. It seemed like we'd always been on that raft, you know. And I gripped it and I didn't want them to go. You know, I thought, I'm not going to let go of this rope, because if I do, they might just not bother picking us up, you know. Like, I know it's a weird idea, but I grabbed hold of that. And we couldn't make it fast because there was nothing on the dinghy to make it fast to. And gradually, we closed with the Toka Maru, and we were climbing onto the deck and touching the deck of the Toka Maru, the wooden deck. And it was like a dream unfolding, you know. Dougal said to the Japanese, he said, can you save the dinghy? You know, it wasn't for the dinghy. We didn't want the dinghy. We wanted the food that was in it. We'd saved that food. We'd saved that water. That was valuable to us. And the captain of the fishing boat said, we've got food. We've got food on this ship. And Dougal, we still didn't trust them. We wanted to save our food, and so we saved the dinghy, and we pulled the dinghy over onto the deck of the Toka Maru. You won't believe how small that dinghy is. It's a little cockle shell. But it had been our home for 38 days.
Did you have any resentment towards your parents for
Never.
taking you? No?
Never. And, you know, I thank my dad every day of my life now for what he did. Took us on this amazing adventure that just didn't turn out right, but it wasn't Dougal's fault. And although my mum and dad never forgave themselves for it, we forgave them straight away. I wrote a poem on the raft, and I finished the last line of it, or my mum did for me, on the ship on the way home. And and I remember her bursting into tears and saying that we should never have done this. And I said to her then, I said, Mum, nobody died, we've all got home. I said, you know, it wasn't the ending that we wanted, but what we did was great. And having survived that was also great. You know, it was a great feat that they'd achieved, my mum and dad together. My mum cared for us, and the twins had a little supper every night. She made sure that they had some extra food because they were so young. Life is never so joyous as when you're alive and you know you could lose it at any moment. You know, just living can be very joyous when you know that you might not be alive on the next wave. And we'd lost that. You know, now we were going to face a new life without the Lucette. and without anything, actually. We were not insured. We'd lost everything when the Lucette went down. But that was the amazing story. We were 25 miles out in latitude, 100 miles out in longitude from our position with no navigational instruments whatsoever. So what happened out there on the Pacific was fairly unique. It was a family. The experience out there had changed our lives forever, because you can't have those thoughts and it not change you. And so even now, and as I say, it was 50 years ago last year, a lot of the memories are still with me about how we'd survived. And, you know, you make your own luck, I know, but we were all so lucky.
And I remember unlocking my phone and WhatsApp was on, and I kind of closed WhatsApp and clicked on the camera. And the second I clicked the film, I saw what I guess the whole world saw.